Hello, this is Professor and Counselor Robert Alexander, and today we are focused on Chapter 18. So, as always, as a constant reminder, as I'm speaking, you should be taking notes. These notes are going to come in handy when it's time to take your tests, when it's time to do written assignments. So, we're going to go ahead and get into it. So, Chapter 18 deals with sexually explicit materials, sex workers, and sex laws. So the main topics are sexually explicit material in contemporary society, sex work and sex traffic, sexuality, and law. So sexually explicit materials in contemporary society. Sexually explicit material is difficult to study objectively because we all have our own various opinions based on our schema, right? So it often triggers deep and conflicting feelings about sexuality. One area of difficulty is that what constitutes erotica or pornography is subjective. Erotica, this stems from the Greek word, the Greek form of love poem, a love poem, sexually explicit material that can be evaluated positively, often involving mutuality, respect, affection, and a balance of power, and it may be considered artistic, right? But pornography differs where it says sexually explicit material that may be evaluated negatively and might include anything that depicts sexuality and causes sexual arousal in the viewer, right? So one is artistic and one is considered entertainment. Both considered entertainment, but one is more considered artistic. So, sexually explicit material in contemporary society. Sexually explicit materials are legal in the United States, but materials that are obscene are not legal. Obscenity, from the Latin for filth, right, generally implies a personal or societal judgment that something is offensive. Sexually explicit material, SEM, materials whose primary themes, topics, or depictions involve sexuality that may cause sexual arousal. Sexually explicit videos and films, commonly called pornography, are widely consumed, right? We have XTube, we have Pornhub, we have a lot of different mediums in which pornography is viewed by all different kinds of viewers. SEM has become an integral part of popular culture, books and magazines, live entertainment, the internet, cable, and on-demand television. DVDs and sexually explicit videos are now downloadable films. So most have been marketed to the heterosexual men, but women are increasingly becoming consumers, and the internet caters to all. The consumption of sexually explicit materials, many people use SEM of various types and themes. Erotic stories can be very intriguing. Phone apps related to sex are on the rise. Sexually explicit magazines, sending and receiving nude or semi-nude photos, watching sexually explicit videos. About 1/3 of US's college students report viewing SEV in the past 30 days, right? Sexually explicit videos. Reasons have not been thoroughly studied, but we know that folks do it for different levels of arousal or excitement. So this internet-based survey asked 975 U.S. men and 1,046 U.S. women aged 18 to 70 about their consumption of sexually explicit materials. In the past, 23.9% men and women combined indicated that they had watched sexually explicit videos or DVDs in the past year, 38.8% in their lifetime. Take a few seconds, pause the video, and view this chart. Themes, content, and actors of SEV. Many mainstream SEV target males, heterosexuals, and portray stereotypes of male sexuality. Research shows that while the vast majority of activities are depicted as consensual, they portray differing levels of objectification, power, and violence. Criticisms include that there is little focus on relationships and emotional intimacy, and that content reinforces an unhealthy and unrealistic image of sexuality. Femme porn, feminist values videos. So less male-centered and more reflective of women's erotic fantasies. Themes, content, and actors of sexually explicit videos continue. Homosexual sexuality explicit film differs somewhat. Gay porn tends to focus on eroticism of the male body. Lesbian explicit films usually depict realistic sexual interactions with a range of body types and both butch and femme styles. Sex between men is rarely shown in heterosexual films, which do sometimes show sex between women. You see that double standard right there. Actresses in adult entertainment are generally viewed negatively. The so-called damaged goods hypothesis. Researchers have found no support for the concept. Less is known about men adult film performers. The effects of sexually explicit videos: scrotum or scrotal sac, a pouch of skin hanging loosely at the root of the penis that holds the two testes. More heavily pigmented that skin elsewhere. Sparsely covered by hair. Divided by divided in the middle by a ridge of skin. Testes are pulled closer to the body when a man is sexually aroused or when he is cold. These changes are controlled by the dartos muscles and fibrous cremaster muscles, as learned in chapter 4. Evidence of causal relationships between exposure and pornography and sexual aggression is slim. For some, pornography may instead have a catharsis effect, a way of alleviating sexual aggression. Some feminists view SEV as inherently degrading and dehumanizing to women. There's considerable disagreement. Others note sexually explicit materials can contribute to women's sexual growth and sexual power. Child pornography is a form of child sexual exploitation. Many children exploited in this way exhibit distress and poor adjustment, may suffer from depression, anxiety, and guilt, and may become destructive and antisocial. Children's sexting has contributed to what some call the golden age of child pornography. Laws governing obscenity and child pornography apply. Child pornography has been found to be patently offensive and not within the zone of free speech. Censorship, sexually explicit material, and the law. To censor means to examine in order to suppress or delete anything considered objectionable. Censorship occurs when the government, private groups, or individuals impose their moral or political values on others by suppressing words, ideas, or images they deem offensive. Censorship continues to flourish at state and local levels in schools and in libraries. Censorship, sexually explicit material, and the law. To determine obscenity, a set of criteria has emerged. Dominant theme must appeal to prurient sexual interests and portray sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. Taken as a whole, it must be without serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Reasonable people must find it to possess no social value. These criteria are highly subjective. The issues of child protection. Our inability to find criteria for objectively defining obscenity makes it potentially dangerous to censor such material, restricting speech otherwise guaranteed by the First Amendment. Laws intended to prevent child pornography and protect children invariably come up against this conflict. Sex work and sex trafficking. Prostitution, historically, the exchange of sexual behaviors for money and or goods, is pejorative. More recently, the terms sex worker and commercial sex worker have been used by sex industry workers. Sex work occurs in a variety of types. Women selling sex to men is the most common form, followed by male sex workers making themselves available to men. Sex trafficking, a growing international market of human sex slaves that has fueled the economies of some developing countries. The prevalence of sex work. Different definition of sex work and the secrecy that is often involved make detailed study difficult. One study of men from around the world found that about 9 to 10% have purchased sex from a female in the past year. Many sex workers had a sharp decrease in customers or frequency of visits during the COVID-19 pandemic, greatly affecting their financial needs. Many sex workers who accept money or drugs for sex do not consider themselves prostitutes. Those who identify themselves as sex workers can often earn more money from sex work than from any other types of work. It is lucrative, right? And that's why it's attractive to a lot of people. Childhood victimization is likely a background factor for both girls and boys' interest into sex work. Many women began working as sex workers in their younger years, even in their early teens. Girls are usually introduced into sex work by pimps upon whom they become emotionally and financially dependent. Once involved, women are frequently abused by their pimps and run the risk of abuse from customers. So, street-based sex workers are highly prevalent in parts of San Francisco and parts of East and West Oakland. Sex workers who solicit customers on the street are especially vulnerable to violence. The prevalence of sex work. There's a wide range of motivations and backgrounds among those who enter sex work. Many environmental, social, and financial and personal factors appear to be involved. Adolescent sex workers are often runaways who have engaged in sexual risk behaviors. Sex workers are aware of the psychological and physical costs, including illness and death, but their sense of self worth may not be directly attributable to their work. In many countries, sex work has become part of the tourist economy. Forms of female sex work. Street based sex workers constitute about 10% of sex workers in the United States. They are more visible and are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be beaten, robbed, or raped, suffer more occupational hazards, and have less control over their work. Work in brothels has higher status and is safer. Most today have been replaced by massage parlors where the intent is disguise. Call girls have the highest status. Male sex workers. Most research focuses on street hustlers, the male equivalent of streetwalkers. Other types include call boys, rent boys, masseurs, sex workers who work out of gay bars, and kept boys. Minorities are gigolos, heterosexual men providing sexual service for women in exchange for money. Overwhelmingly, majority sell their services to other males, and most identify as gay or bisexual. Most males are introduced to sex work through influence of their peers and the promise of easy money. Gay male sex workers engage in prostitution as a means of expressing their sexuality and making money. Male clients and male sex workers typically insist on protecting themselves from HIV, STIs. Little is known about transgender sex workers. So, sex work and the law. Female sex work is extensively prosecuted. The male patron is seldom arrested. Solicitation, a word, gesture, or action that implies an offer of sex for sale. There are those who favor and those who oppose the discrimination and legalization of sex work. Whatever one stance, treating juvenile prostitute as delinquent overlooks the ways that they are victimized. So we must always treat the juvenile as the victim. And the person that was psychologically abusive or that got them into sex work is the one that is deemed as the perpetrator, right? That is the person that is more responsible for it viewed as a crime. So we have to get away from treating the juvenile or the adolescent prostitute as someone that is the perpetrator of the crime, because it usually happens through psychological abuse. The impact of HIV and AIDS and other STIs on sex work. For several reasons, female, male, and transgender prostitutes are at a higher risk for STIs and HIV and AIDS. Many are injection drug users. They have numerous partners. They do not always require their customer to use condoms. Male sex workers engage in high-risk sexual practices, especially anal intercourse, and have a high risk of clientele. Joint United Nations Program, or AIDS, notes sex workers face barriers in HIV prevention due to the criminalization of sex work and numerous restrictive laws and regulations. Sexuality and the law. The basic tenet of our society is that all Americans are equal under the law, but state laws regarding sexuality vary widely. Sodomy laws were used to target individuals participating in same-sex behavior. Considered a milestone ruling in 2003's Lawrence et al. Versus Texas, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Texas law that banned sex between people of the same gender, thereby invalidating any remaining anti-sodomy laws in the U.S. Discrimination persists in many areas of life for gay men and lesbian women. Same-sex marriage. Legal marriage for same-sex couples has been a major social and political issue in the United States. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. which had defined marriage as between one man and one woman. By this time, more than half of Americans supported the legalization of gay marriage. In 2015, Obergefell and Hodges versus Hodges, the court legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. This was monumental. As the mid-20s, 29 countries had legally approved the freedom to marry for same-sex couples. Advocating sexual rights. Policymakers and advocates of free speech continue to scrutinize state sexuality laws and enforcement practices and to monitor and report on them. In many ways, sexuality-related laws reflect an ambivalence about sexuality in America's culture, meaning there is still a lot of things up in the air. Folks are still undecided about how they view sexuality-related laws. The ambivalence is particularly evident with issues related to sexuality, education, and abortion. We have various different opinions on that. Further legal protection of fundamental sexual rights is needed for people to fully attain individual sexual health. Again, we talked about sexually explicit material in contemporary society, sex work and sex trafficking, sexuality, and law. So hopefully you have been able to take notes and learn from this particular chapter. This chapter was a very vocabulary heavy chapter that dealt with sexuality in terms of juvenile sexuality, sex workers, sex trafficking, and how society views them. Take a moment to take everything in. Take a moment to look at your notes, and hopefully you'll have enough information to do well on that quiz or on that written assignment that is embedded in Canvas. This is Professor Alexander, and I will see you on the next chapter.